Hope to be able to explain my argument pretty well today. As I turned in the proposal and then started writing the paper and realized this is really two papers, but I should be able to get through the real core of all of the argument this morning, and hopefully it'll be enough for y'all to have some good questions to ask me. So, here we go. A renewed conversation has sprung up about whether the doctrine of divine simplicity entails modal collapse. Ryan Mullen in particular claims that simplicity cannot escape entailing modal collapse, and his reasoning follows a straightforward track from the identity of God's absolutely necessary nature with his creative act, which would make that act also absolutely necessary. His conclusion shows that the actual world exists of absolute necessity. If the actual world exists of absolute necessity, though, then no other world can be genuinely possible, and modal collapse follows. In a recent article Mullins co-authored with Shannon Eugene Bird, they state the argument like this, and you have that on your handout, M1 through M9. God's existence is absolutely necessary. Anything that is identical to God's existence must be absolutely necessary. All of God's intentional actions are identical to each other, such that there is only one divine act. God's one divine act is identical to God's existence. Therefore, God's one divine act is absolutely necessary. God's intentional act to create the universe is identical to God's one divine act. If God's one divine act is absolutely necessary, then God's intentional act to create the universe is absolutely necessary. Therefore, God's intentional act to create the universe is absolutely necessary. Therefore, the universe exists of absolute necessity. All right, and so that's just their modal collapse argument. And it relies on the full identity under simplicity of all of God's attributes, or descriptions of his attribute, I think is more accurate, and that being identical with his divine act. And his divine act being the necessary causal explanation for what exists. My issue here is not with Mullins and Bird's argument, which seems to me to be valid. Instead, my question is whether this argument is only a special case of a broader problem that haunts divine world actualization regardless of whether one holds to simplicity. First, at least within the contemporary discussion, metaphysical modal collapse implies that a particular world exists necessarily and no other worlds are metaphysically possible. And in general, that's how they've taken absolute necessity as the broadest sense of necessity, and that's metaphysical necessity in their view, and in many other people's view. While modal collapse can be couched as a lack of contingency or a potentiality, most of the arguments for or against it use possible world semantics to some degree or another. Using possible world semantics proves both helpful and is the normal parlance of the current simplicity conversation. To discuss a lack of contingency in terms of possible worlds shifts the focus of the conversation in some important ways, though. If one assumes simplicity, then one cannot merely say that God created the universe, meaning the physical cosmos, of absolute necessity. There are many conceivable ways that this cosmos that a world could be that contain the state of affairs that our universe's timeline exists. If by the term universe, Mullins and Bird mean our physical cosmos, then this argument would work just as well to prove that God of absolute necessity created some actual subatomic particle in some actual subatomic state. God's act of creating some actual particle cannot be considered modally equivalent to his act of creating the actual universe because the particle could have existed with some other universe being actual. By the same reasoning, this universe's timeline could have existed as a state of affairs embedded in a variety of larger states of affairs. It could be embedded in a physical multiverse. It could be in a series of universes that exist sequentially. In terms of modal argumentation, the entailments of God's acts go from larger to smaller states of affairs, but not the other way around. Creating the universe entails actualizing all of its aspects, but actualizing any individual aspect of the universe does not entail the universe is all of actuality. God's actualizing a particular world, that is a maximally consistent state of affairs, can entail his creating the universe, but his creating the universe does not entail his actualizing some particular world. Mullins and Bird are not necessarily wrong in their conclusion, but the scope of God's absolute necessity needs to be maximized. To get a true modal collapse, God's absolutely necessary act must be to actualize some particular world, W, as a maximally consistent state of affairs. With this reorientation of the issue, Mullins and Bird would not really be breaking new territory in claiming that God may have lacked freedom in his choice of world to actualize. Leibniz argued centuries ago that God must have created the one and only best possible world due to his moral perfection, omniscience, and omnipotence. The question about divine freedom in the world actualization within the scope of the best possible worlds problem has been taken up by Thomas Morris, Robert Adams, Daniel Howard Snyder, Alexander Pruss, and others. So, in that sense, the fact that modal collapse restricts God's freedom isn't all that new. It's just being applied to the simplicity argument here. Now, what's the broader problem that I see? Consider the following principle, which is on your sheet, which I will call the theistic actualization principle. That is, necessarily, a world W is actual if and only if God actualizes W. TAP seems uncontroversial and is even partly endorsed by Mullins and Bird on page 42 of their most recent article from 2022. To deny it would mean either that the world could be actual without God having actualized it, or that God could actualize a world and yet it fail to be actual. The latter is nonsense if we assume that God is omnipotent, and the former is a consequence of assuming that God is the causal explanation for all that exists, something Christian theists generally hold regardless of their views on simplicity. A world cannot happen to be actual without God having actualized it. We can add the modal status necessarily in TAP because this principle must govern actualization of worlds globally within the universe of possibilities. So it's a proposition that must be true in all worlds. If we take our broadened version of Mullins and Bird's claims, that is that what God is actualizing is a world rather than just a physical cosmos, we get the following sequence, which you also see on your handout there. Given TAP, necessarily, a world W is actual if and only if God actualizes W. So by M8 in Mullins and Bird's arguments, necessarily God actualizes A, that is the actual world, and that's my reframing. They say the universe, I'm saying the actual world A. And then if you just take the modal axiom K, which is just the axiom of Kripkean modal logic, and which is one of the lowest modal logics, right? We're not all the way up to S5, we're just at K. And you look at that axiom, then you apply it to TAP and 1 together, you get necessarily A is actual. So in this sequence, K is an axiom of the Kripkean modal logic, also called K. And if we interpret 1 and 2 in possible world semantics, we get that alpha is the actual world from the perspective of every world in the domain of discourse, which Mullins and Bird want to be the domain of all metaphysically possible worlds, without which we would not get a modal collapse. Whatever we mean by absolute necessity, it must encompass all metaphysically possible worlds. So that's just showing how what they're arguing is a special case of applying their premises with TAP and just using normal modal logical axioms. One way to circumvent modal collapse would be to assume that more than one world can simultaneously be metaphysically actual. Klaus Cray has argued in a different context that God could actualize a multiverse of mutually inaccessible possible worlds, all of which achieve a certain threshold of quality. Circumventing the modal collapse problem through a full or partial modal explosion does not solve the larger issue at play, though. Mullins and Bird are not only concerned with the reality of modal collapse, but also with the unpleasant implications it carries for ideas like God's freedom, human responsibility, and more. If God actualizes a multiplicity of worlds, one must still deal with the apparent restraint on his creative choices that simplicity presents. Furthermore, a counterpart of me, even one that could be truly called me, existing in some parallel world that acts differently than me in this world, does not solve the problem of my own apparent determinism in this world. For these additional problems, it does not seem to matter whether God can simultaneously actualize many worlds or just one. We will therefore assume, without loss of generality, that God only actualizes one world. Suppose that we deny simplicity, so that God's actions in actualizing a world are no longer identical with each other, or with his absolutely necessary nature. We would seem to be relieved of the problem of modal collapse because God can now contemplate the various worlds at his disposal, select one for actualization on the basis of some divine evaluation, and then actualize that world. Thus, many worlds are genuinely metaphysically possible, and God simply selects the one which will be actual based on his contemplation and divine evaluation. However, there is an issue of self-reference that causes problems. If we accept our theistic actualization principle, then a world can be actual only if God actualizes it. God's actualizing activity must be considered within every world, though, unless we abandon the notion that God's activity bears on modality in the same way that any other aspects of worlds bear on modality, which would separate the kind of necessity that governs God's nature versus that governing metaphysical possibility. Then God's activity must be included within worlds themselves and not be considered as something outside of worlds. After all, worlds are all-encompassing things. They can be viewed as maximally consistent states of affairs or as maximal propositions. You can take planning as an analogy of world books. No matter what, worlds must entail the truth or falsity of any proposition placed before them, or they're not worlds at all. In light of the nature of worlds, consider the proposition that describes how more than one world could be actual, but that a single one among them is actual. Specifically, consider that proposition along with our theistic actualization principle. What would it mean to say that God actualizes alpha, and on mine it says A and B, but I call them alpha and beta just to make sure you understand I'm talking about worlds. Actualizing alpha, but also that God could have actualized beta. It could look like this, and this is number 3 on your handout. God actualizes alpha, and possibly God actualizes beta. Right, this is the idea of he actualizes one world, but he could have actualized another. So possibly God actualizes beta. 3 would mean that some world, W, accessible from alpha, contains the state of affairs that God actualizes beta. However, beta is a world and not just some state of affairs in W. It cannot be true in some non-beta world that God actualizes beta, while at the same time being false in beta that God actualizes beta. Such a situation would mean that in that world W, beta has a state of affairs that God actualizes it, when in fact beta itself lacks that state of affairs. Something that is possibly true about a world is necessarily true about that world, because worlds are what they are, right? They're maximal descriptions, and they entail the truth or falsity of any proposition. Something that is possibly true about a world is necessarily true about that world. Given 3, it would be necessarily true that beta contains the state of affairs that God actualizes it. And here we have reached a contradiction on the grounds that God actualizes only one world. It cannot be true in any world both that God actualizes alpha and that God actualizes beta. For the application of our theistic actualization principle would mean both alpha is actual and beta is actual are true in that world. But we have that exact situation realized in the case of alpha itself. More generally, since both alpha and beta would contain the state of affairs that God actualizes them, it would be, again, a straightforward application of the Kripkean axiom K and the theistic actualization principle to show necessarily alpha and beta are both actual. An extension of the argument which would show that all supposedly actualizable worlds must in fact necessarily be actual. Thus, we seem to have a good argument that there are no actualizable but non-actual worlds on the basis of our theistic actualization principle. Again, this stems from the fact that God's actualizing activity is contained and described by any world he actualizes, or any world at all, and not something outside of and applied to worlds, which seems to be a distinction Mullins and Bird make. They seem to separate God's actions from the description of worlds, because they're not talking about full possible worlds in their argument. To circumvent this problem, one would need to deny the theistic actualization principle, or demonstrate that possible world semantics is incorrect as an interpretation of modality, or separate the modality governing God from the modality governing worlds by disallowing God's actions as being states of affairs described in worlds. I don't believe that any of these options work. Rejecting this theistic actualization principle has been considered above and has entailments that theists generally do not want to endorse. Rejecting possible world semantics as an appropriate model for interpreting modality requires one to explain what exactly modal collapse is, if not reducing the universe of possible worlds to a singleton. Further, one would need to show how that alternative interpretation is not isomorphic to and is superior to the possible world's interpretation. And given that possible world semantics is the dominant interpretation for modality used in most other theistic conversations, such a rejection would have broad and undesirable implications. The third option, that we can separate the types of modality, seems to me to be ad hoc, and it actually undermines the modal collapse argument anyway, because God having an absolutely necessary nature doesn't bear on the absolute necessity of any world at that point, if we separate those modalities. So, it seems to me that there's a modal collapse problem no matter what, particularly because we assume that God is the world actualizer. Right, so here we have a particularly theistic problem when it comes to world actualization. So then I want to move on and describe how you can still salvage divine freedom even in a modal collapse situation, and how actually simplicity might be the way to do that. Theists want God to be the world actualizer, and yet worlds include descriptions of God's actions, including his act of world actualization. It would seem, based on the argument above, that modal collapse follows more generally from God's world actualizer role and not uniquely from simplicity. In other words, it seems that we have no choice but to bite the bullet, in Mullins and Bird's words, that we have to accept modal collapse. The next question is whether one can salvage any meaningful notion of divine freedom from the modal collapse. In the argument that follows, I want to focus specifically on the denial of divine freedom, which would mean that we can provide some definite demonstration that God lacked the ability to choose which world he in fact actualized. If such an explanation cannot be provided, then the question about divine freedom at least remains open, even if a positive argument for freedom or a positive model of freedom has not been expounded. Suppose first that we deny simplicity and assume that God's actualizing action, contemplation of, evaluation of, and choosing from among the possibilities can be distinguished and causally sequenced. So we're denying simplicity and assuming these are separate actions that can be causally sequenced in the divine action, in the divine series of actions. As we saw above, these actions would then become states of affairs within worlds. We run into another self-referential problem. On the one hand, God may contemplate all worlds and understand within them his acts of contemplation as they are described by those worlds, realizing that only alpha contains the state of affairs where his contemplation leads to actualization of that same world. On the other hand, God may contemplate worlds without considering how they describe his acts of contemplation, and decide which world to actualize based on that limited consideration of them as incomplete worlds. However, this leads to the contradictory conclusion that God may contemplate a world and choose to actualize it when the full description of that world includes the state of affairs that God contemplated it but chose not to actualize it. We do not quite encounter a full Russellian paradox, but we find something akin to it. If we try to circumvent these two options by claiming that perhaps God's contemplative and evaluative activity is identical in every world, but that his choice for actualization may differ, we must abandon that his contemplation and evaluation have any causal connection to his choice, which seems counterintuitive. In the end, it seems that God's creative act is not one of choice, but one of finding the needle in the haystack, finding the world that contains the correct state of affairs that align with the sequence of his actualizing actions. So that seems to be what happens if you deny simplicity. If you separate out his actions, then he seems to actually lose his freedom because he's looking for the world in which his contemplation leads to his actualization rather than having a choice in what to actualize. Now, what would happen if we assume simplicity? Would we run into the same kind of problem? Since all of God's acts are now identical to one another, one can speak of God contemplating worlds, evaluating their aspects, and deciding to actualize one particular world without being constrained by the state of affairs contained in those worlds because no causal, temporal, or logical series exists in those actions. God's contemplation is just his evaluation, which is just his choosing, which is just his actualization. And this, in my opinion, is what's overlooked in Mullins and Bird's argument. They only talk about his act of creation, and they don't consider that contemplation and evaluation might also be identical to that act of creation. And so we can talk about those the same way in simplicity that we talk about omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and yet we assume those are all the same thing. We just talk about them in different ways. So God's contemplation just is his evaluation, which just is his choosing, which just is his actualization. All of these being identical means that the state of affairs God actualizes this world, which can only be indexically true in a single world, does not have a determinative, restrictive, or even causal impact on God's contemplation, considering, or choosing. It is equivalent to the state of affairs God contemplates W, God evaluates W, and God chooses to or not to actualize W for every W in the universe of worlds. The following four actions are the same proposition under simplicity, and this is 4 through 7 on your sheet. God contemplates the variety of worlds. He considers the merit of creating each world in the variety of worlds. He chooses to actualize a particular world alpha over and against W for every world W distinct from alpha, and God actualizes alpha. Those are all identical within simplicity. God does not consider the universe of worlds only to realize he is constrained to a specific one, for that is at least a logical sequence in 4 through 7. The critic who charges that God could not have chosen differently than he did must find some logically prior principle to 4 through 7 that causally restricts God. This prior principle cannot be God's absolutely necessary nature, because that is also identical with everything in 4 through 7. That it alone, among the universe of worlds, contains the indexical state of affairs God actualizes this world. Further, alpha alone contains the state of affairs directly on account of number 6 in that sequence. However, if 4 through 7 are propositionally identical, then alpha alone contains the state of affairs directly on account of any of 4 through 7 that one chooses. The logical tension that arises from propositionally equating 4 through 7, in my mind, is not terribly different than the logical tension experienced in trying to explain the Trinity in a way that retains a single divine being but allows 3 distinct persons, or trying to describe God's attributes under simplicity as being equivalent even though we talk about them in different ways. Tension does not entail contradiction. And I claim that it does not contradict in, tension doesn't entail contradiction in the latter, that is, discussions about the Trinity. And I claim it does not entail contradiction in the former either. While we may not be able at this point to offer a positive model of God's freedom in world actualization given divine simplicity, we have at least argued that we cannot assume such a model is impossible. And that's really what I set out to do, is to say, is it possible to show that he doesn't definitely lose his freedom? So in that sense, I'm doing a Plantingian move, like with his free will defense, and saying, well, it's not definitely false that that the counterfactual situations may prove that trans-world depravity exists. As long as it's not definitely false, then it remains possibly open. Right, so that's all I'm really arguing for there. I haven't delineated a full theory of God's freedom. I've just shown it's not definitely not there because of the way that these things get identified with one another. But it is, I think, not there if you differentiate them. So that's God's freedom. What about human freedom? And this is where the real Kripkean idea comes into this. Another undesirable aspect of biting the bullet about modal collapse is its apparent impact on human freedom. If this world alpha is the only metaphysically possible world, what are we to make of our intuitions that we could have acted differently than we in fact act? Human freedom requires a new model under this means of defending simplicity from the modal collapse argument. In his essay entitled The Philosophical Significance of a Kripkean Necessary a Posteriori, Scott Soames sets out to illustrate or to illuminate aspects of Saul Kripke's semantic theory of names from naming and necessity. One of the implications of a Kripkean view is the introduction of propositions that are necessarily true but known only a posteriori. For example, the claim water is H2O in a Kripkean system is necessarily true since the referent for water is the substance with a molecular makeup of 1 oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. However, one only discovers that substance named water is H2O a posteriori. A similar instance occurs with the morning star and the evening star. The star that visibly persists the longest into the morning may be named Hesperus, and the star that first appears in the evening can be named Phosphorus. Only upon investigation does one realize that these are actually the same object. It's actually the planet Venus. That Hesperus, it just is phosphorus. Prior to learning this a posteriori necessary truth, one could justifiably conceive that Hesperus could be something other than phosphorus, meaning that the thing called by those two names was in fact 2 distinct things. Once the truth is found, though, one can no longer claim it even as a conceivability that Hesperus might not be phosphorus. This is under a Kripkean system. The referent of the 2 names have been fixed so that nothing else could have been phosphorus or Hesperus in order to make them distinct. If naming and reference operate in this Kripkean manner, then the question about a posteriori necessity can be posed of many things. Consider the world in which humans actually exist. And I mean the possible world, not just the cosmos. What does it mean to say that God actualized this world? The actual world is a name, and in the Kripkean system, you kind of like, you point at something and you're like, that stuff there, that's water. So you kind of go, this thing here, this is what I'm talking about when I mean the actual world, this thing that we're in, actuality. But it's a name, it's not a description, right? The actual world is a moniker actual humans place on the reality in which we live. Contrast the name the actual world with a true world in the semantic sense, which is described in virtue of its definition as a state of affairs. Because worlds are maximal state of affairs, they are also maximal descriptions. A world may be given a name W or V or alpha, but the nature of a world is that of being a maximally consistent state of affairs. In a Kripkean position, the actual world, the name the actual world, acts semantically in the same mode as Hesperus, and the name of some world, some maximal state of affairs, acts semantically like phosphorus. To say that the actual world is alpha is just to say that the metaphysical reality humans call the actual world had, has, and will have the same states of affairs as those in the world named alpha. Humans do not inhabit a set or a maximal state of affairs. Actuality is not a world in the semantic sense. Instead, the states of affairs that describe actuality can be the same as those described by some world alpha. It should be noted, of course, that the actual world, as it has played out to this moment in time, is not a true world, because it's not maximum. In order to describe this thing that we're in, that we call the actual world, as a world in the semantic sense, one must make an assumption about the fixedness of the future, or the referent of the actual world is never truly fixed. The referent, absent a fixed future, would be a class of worlds that have past and presents exactly like those that describe the past and present of this place, but it continually loses members with every passing moment. When a moment of the future for an observer bound within the actual world becomes the present and then the past, worlds must be excluded from the class within the referent. In this case, it would be nonsensical to say that the actual world is alpha, because the referent of those two names isn't identical. One is a class of worlds and one is a single world. Going back to the previous section and bringing in the assumption that God actualized a world as his creative act, let us assume that the actual world really does have a unique world as its referent. At the very least, because God knows the full set of states of affairs that did, do, and will constitute actuality. What effect would this have on human experience, and particularly on human freedom? I argue that knowing this fact produces no change whatsoever in our notions of human freedom. For humans can never say with certainty that of any particular world, that is the actual world. We don't know. Right? Humans can never say with certainty the actual world is W for any world W, regardless of the world the variable W takes on as a referent. Despite every state of affairs in the actual world being metaphysically necessary by virtue of the modal collapse that we've derived, a non-omniscient being in the actual world learns the necessary truths that these states of affairs represent only a posteriori. The issue of metaphysical modal collapse becomes nothing more from a human epistemic perspective than the admission that the past is necessarily what it's turned out to be. The future remains conceptually open to us, not metaphysically, but epistemically. Everything about the future is metaphysically necessarily what it will be. No other world is possible, but we already acknowledge this by affirming God's omniscience or his sovereign selection of a world anyway. I argue that our freedom is dependent on alternative worlds being epistemically possible for us and not metaphysically possible for us. And that's the other aspect of the Kripkean system that I'm utilizing, is that it separates epistemic possibility from metaphysical possibility. Epistemic possibility being those possibilities we view as maybe metaphysically possible until a posteriori we learn that they never were. And so in that sense, we can salvage most of the important aspects that we treasure of human freedom and at the same time acknowledge there is only one metaphysically possible world. And really to conclude, I don't think that this is surprising. If we really view that God is the grounding of all metaphysical reality, human choices ought not to be able to generate metaphysical reality. It should only play out metaphysical reality. God generates metaphysical reality. He doesn't cede over part of that ability to generate metaphysical reality to us by virtue of our choices. So, that's my Kripkean defense of divine simplicity.